places for the wildflowers that he'd seen. Well, out of those 50, it's really interesting that 4 of those 50 are in our state of California, which means that, according to Bob Gibbons, not a Californian, an Englishman, we have 8% of the best places to see wildflowers in the entire world right here at our doorstep in the state of California.
Wildflower wonders.
Yeah.
There's Holstein.
Oh, sorry. Use the, yeah.
Okay. Well, the amazing wildflowers of California we're having a few technical difficulties here getting started. So after traveling by foot from the upper Midwest down to the Gulf of Mexico, he sailed out to California and walked down from San Francisco through the Coast Range in the spring, and then walked east across the Central Valley. And he was the first one to really describe in English what the valley was like before farms and irrigation had started and changed it drastically. And what he found was miles and miles of flowers. Flowers that just went on, it seemed like forever. Those flower fields, which he called bee pastures because the flowers were just humming with bees as far as he could see. These bee pastures now are a distant memory because the area that he walked through in the upper San Joaquin Valley is now dense with towns and farmland, irrigated farmland. The wildflowers are gone, but we have, from his descriptions, memories of what it was like as he walked across the valley on the way to Yosemite, which he has described in such a way that it made it a destination for people all over the world. But even though those flower fields and that he described are gone now, there are places in California where bee pastures, just like he described, are still around. They still exist. They haven't all been destroyed. They are still there. And you can see a landscape very much like the one that John Muir walked across and wrote about, that we now, through his words, can imagine. But we don't have to just imagine them from his words, because landscapes very much like he described still exist in California. Flowers as far as you can see, bee pastures, miles and miles of flowers and bees, of flowers of many different colors. Some yellow, some purple, some orange, some blue, even up into the hillsides. The bee pastures are still here in California. And the way he described the Central Valley was not flowers amid grass, which is what he had all seen in the eastern United States on his walk from Wisconsin down to the Gulf of Mexico, but grass amid the flowers. He'd never seen a place that had so many flowers and just a little bit of grass. And today, even the Central Valley, with all its irrigated agriculture, there's still places where you can see bee pastures, flowers as far as you can see, going on for miles. This one is in the floor of the Central Valley in Kern County. Well, it got cold after spending the summer in Yosemite, and John Muir walked back west across the Central Valley again, and he found flowers going on for miles, but they were completely different than the ones he'd seen in the springtime. The ones in the fall were this species here, And they also went on forever as far as he could see with their flowers, but flowers very different than the ones he saw. It's the Vergate tar plant. And it's beautiful in its own way as well. Going from the valley floor up into the foothills. Many, many miles of this Vergate tar plant with its flowers and very odoriferous plant. Well, his description of the Central Valley was something that was completely forgotten by academics until fairly recently, primarily because of this man, Frederick Clemens, who was considered to be America's greatest ecologist. From Nebraska, he laid down the rules for ecology, the ones that were in all the textbooks, even at the time I was in botany. That was the gospel for plant ecology in North America, the things that Frederick Clemens talked about. And they didn't leave any place for fields of wildflowers in his theory. That didn't count. And he published this map basically saying that vegetation was based on climate. So where it was wet in the eastern US, there were forests. When it was drier in the central US, there were prairies that went on all the way from Mexico well up into Canada. This is the yellow. But interestingly enough, he gerrymandered a piece of that yellow of the Midwest in our Central Valley. He said the Central Valley, even though it was vegetation was controlled by climate, he must have thought that the Central Valley had the same kind of climate as Nebraska where he worked, because he gave it the same color, that bright yellow, that we see in Nebraska. And since Nebraska had bunch grass, and that was a common plant in Nebraska, he looked for a relative here in California, and he found blue needlegrass. And because he said that that was what covered all of California, pretty much except where there were shrubs and trees, that turned into an industry where this particular grass, native grass, was planted. Millions of dollars were spent on plantings of this particular native grass. It even got planted in the front yard of the Davis Post Office. But actually, though, if you look at where that grass has been found, all the way from San Joaquin County to Kern County, there's never been a single record except up in the hills. Mostly a plant of the hills. It is a native plant, but it didn't, there's no record of it ever actually covering most of the Central Valley or even being found there at all. The actual grass that is most common in the Central Valley is creeping wild rye. Like this, it's a beautiful native grass. And if you look at its range, it has sites where it's been found all through the Central Valley. It was much more a candidate for the original grass than the purple needlegrass that Clemens claimed was the grass that covered all of the valley. But it wasn't all grass. You can find fields of flowers just like John Muir saw. Basically, bee pastures that still exist here in California. Poppies, for example, miles and miles of poppies. But the story, because Clemens was the one writing the books, was that these were just like weeds, and they only occurred because cows came in, ate all the bunch grass, and left space for flowers. Flowers came in like weeds, and then later on, they were replaced by non-native annual grasses, mostly from the Mediterranean region. In fact, in the textbook about terrestrial vegetation in California, the flowers are pretty much ignored, and it's mostly about bunch grasses in those areas that don't have trees or shrubs as dominants. But a professor down at UC Riverside looked into this, and he went back and looked at the records in Spanish in the archives in Madrid, and he found that the very first Spanish explorers that saw the Central Valley saw the same thing that John Muir saw, except they wrote about it in Spanish. Flowers, as far as you can see, very little grass, if any, flowers and bees for miles and miles. And he talked about the rarity of these fading wildflowers, lost legacy and biological invasions. But the biological invasions were not by the flowers, they were from non-native annual grasses from the Mediterranean, where they had come in contact with agriculture for thousands of years, where the first agriculture was developed. And as a result, they were very susceptible to living and thriving where there's a high level disturbance like there is now in the Central Valley of California. Well, if you look at Omaha, the place in Nebraska that Clement said had the same climate and the same vegetation as California, if you look at Omaha and you compare it to a California climate, you couldn't get two climates probably in the whole world that are more different. Going back to the Omaha climate diagram, heat and rain come together. The growing season is very simple. It's warm and it rains and the plants grow right in the middle of summer. California is just the opposite. It rains in the wintertime when it's cold. This is the rain here on this climate diagram. And then in the summer, the heat goes up and there's no rain. So that means that the plants have to go through their life cycle in many cases in this tiny little narrow window between the cold, rainy winters and the hot, dry summers. And this is the time when you get the super blooms, the flower fields in California, a very short window of time. And fortunately, that's exactly when John Muir walked across the Central Valley and saw those many, many miles of wildflowers. So because that period between the cold, rainy winter and the hot, dry summer is so short, the plants have to do all their sexual reproduction, an attraction of pollinators, attraction of bees, very, very quickly. They don't have a lot of time to hang around. So they have to produce very, very showy flowers that attract pollinators, mostly bees. And that's why our flowers here are so spectacular. You see the same kind of things in many, many families of flowers, but always big and showy in a very short period of time. And you know, you never see, and Bob Gibbons doesn't talk about any great places to see wildflowers in the tropical rainforest where it's warm and wet all year round, because they have flowers there, but they don't have to be showy. They can just hang around all year round and take a bee when the bee comes by, but they don't have to be showy because they can go through their reproductive cycle all the way from January to December, and any time is just fine. Another thing that is significant because of that kind of a climate where it rains in the wintertime when it's cold and then dries out and gets hot in the summertime, is that where that water stays between the wet rainy season and the hot dry summer is really, really important. Here are two different hillsides at the same moment in time. We have one in the foreground that's on volcanic rock, covered with oak trees, and in between the oak trees, the grasses are all brown and dried out. In the hills behind, they're still green at the same moment in May. And that is a different landscape up there. It is very thick in clay. The one in the foreground is full of rocks underneath the trees. So when it's full of rocks, the water, when it falls, goes down deep and cracks in the rocks and feeds the deep roots of the oaks and dries out the surface so that the grass dries out and turns brown much earlier than it does on those hillsides, where the clay keeps that water that falls in the winter close to the surface. So when things start warming up a little bit, the grass then is using that water that's very close to the surface because it doesn't infiltrate very easily in the thick clay. And it's still green when the grasses down on the volcanic rocks are already turning brown. Another thing that's important is the actual chemical makeup. Here we have green grass on one side of Cache Creek's canyon, no green grass on the other side. Chemically, this is a much richer soil full of plant nutrients. This is a very sterile soil that only a few plants can take advantage of, and not ones like grass that grow very rapidly. These tend to be very slow growing plants that gradually take up nutrients, and not a particularly showy place right here for flowers. And as a consequence, much of California is not like the East where it's constant forest or the Midwest where it's constant grassland. You get a mosaic of different kinds of vegetation. You get chaparral, you can get oak woodland, you can get open areas with grass and flowers, all in the same landscape, only a few feet apart, depending on what kind of soils and rocks are beneath it. That's what determines what our landscape looks like. So when you map California vegetation, the main things that are mapped are chaparral, a landscape dominated by shrubs, usually where the drainage is quite good. The water tends to move off quite rapidly. Oak woodland, where it's not quite as well drained, but there's enough water that gets down to the deep roots of the oak trees that they can flourish. But usually there'll be some herbs in between them. But then you have these bee pastures, these fields of flowers, the ones that got forgotten by Frederick Clemens and didn't make it into the textbooks. He talked about all the open areas of California being grasslands, but you don't see grass here, just like John Muir described places like this. A little bit of grass amid the flowers, mostly all flowers. Masses of flowers. You get some grass over here, but a whole hillside of flowers. Landscapes covered with flowers. But because the textbook said all these open areas are supposed to be covered with grass, and that these just came in because the cows ate all the native grasses, and mostly they were replaced by non-native grasses, this is called, in the textbooks up until quite recently, a grassland. But I like to call it a California prairie because there are many places like this where our wildflowers still survive. And those areas are not covered with grasses. And they also are the areas where our native plants flourish, because all those masses of flowers that you saw in those pictures are all native plants. When the grasses become dominant, for the most part, they're not native species. And what we have here with vegetation here in California, even very close together, is a mosaic where if the drainage is really exceptional, chaparral, it's a little less woodland. And then if the water stays close to the surface because of things like clay, you get prairie along an environmental gradient. And also this happens through time. When John Muir walked across the Central Valley and talked about the bee pastures in spring, things were still moist. And you had plants like Tertilia alexa, ethereal spear. When he walked back from Yosemite in the fall, you had plants like Holocarpa virgata, that plant that he saw dominating the Central Valley in the fall. And then there's even a few plants in that dry summer that can thrive, like this perennial lupin, Lupinus formosus. Well, now for the first time, the California Native Plant Society in the study of vegetation is starting to recognize that things weren't so simple. This wasn't just a grassland in every place where there were not a dominance of trees and shrubs, but there were many places where other things dominated, including those fields of flowers that we showed you. And these California prairie areas dominated by flowers were actually mapped. And all those areas in red are where those California prairie areas that were once fields of flowers occur. And you can see that walk from the Coast Range that Muir took over to Yosemite was right across here. Solid flowers. One of the thickest places where red illustrates prairie anywhere in California. But here's a current map. That was historical. You can see most of that prairie is gone now in that area that Muir walked across. But one of the best places where what Muir saw survives is Carrizo Plain National Monument. And it was something that I saw develop into a national monument. Talked to the Nature Conservancy about what a wonderful place it was, and now it's protected. And as a home for the kind of prairie species that once were dominant in the Central Valley of California. It's like a little bit of the Central Valley that still survives untouched in the Coast Range, in a Coast Range valley. Covered with flowers like these azaleas and these phacelias. Phacelias off in the distance, like a lake, almost looks like a lake in the distance. California poppies, lupins. And then this interesting little plant, Calanthus inflatus. It's got a stem that with beautiful purple flowers at the end of it, and the stem's inflated. And you can see this one in Carrizo Plains as well. Well, this is one of the places that Bob Gibbons listed as one of the best places in the world to see wildflowers. And he took this picture of a ridge in Carrizo Plains. And unfortunately, this actually ridge is not part of the National Monument. It should be protected. But anyway, this was the first picture in, except for the cover, in the 50 best places to see wildflowers in the world. And we used that for our Fremontia, the magazine of the California Native Plant Society, on its issues about prairies and grasslands. But if you want to see flowers in mass closer to home, one of the places to do that is at Table Mountain. Table Mountain, instead of clay keeping the water close to the surface, you have a layer of basalt and a very thin soil. So because the water stays close to the surface, it's a great place for wildflowers. But maybe an even closer and more spectacular place is Bear Valley, which is in western Colusa County. It's a place that we're going to have a Tuleyome wildflower trip to. We had one earlier planned, but because the spring was so cold, the plants didn't develop on time, but now they're pretty spectacular. These are platystemons, as far as you can see. Another poppy plant that is only in California. And we find that what was once grazed and made space for wildflowers by Tuleyome, now we have in most places cattle doing the same thing. And the cattle are important because they keep the invasive non-native weeds down and give space for the flowers so that they can thrive, just like John Muir once saw them in the middle of the Central Valley. But just like Carrizo Plain, this is a little satellite valley that never got intensively planted, just like Carrizo Plain. It's got here, some of the plants are bright yellow, but if you notice, these two plants, even though they're bright yellow and in the sunflower family, are completely different species. And we get a mix. We get that platystemon that we saw, that pure white plant with lupins here. And over on the left, bird's eye gilia. Now, of all the families that are in California contributing to its biodiversity, in a way, the family that bird's eye gilia is in has given the most, because it has a very large number of native species and fewer in the rest of the world. So the real center for that family, the one that bird's eye gilia is in right here on the left, is right here in California. We have lots of other things. Here's the Platystemen close up on the upper right and left. Goldfields. Here's the Gilia tricolor again, bird's eye gilia. And then here's a little Montia that is cardamine, another beautiful plant. Here's the Platystemen up close with a different species of Leia over here on the left. And here's that Leia very close up. This is a different Leia platyglossa. Well, one of the things that was very important that Tuleyome did was organize to get a new national monument, Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, and we were successful in getting that created. In 2015, we had the Secretary of the Interior come out, Congress people come out, conservationists come out, and that's how the National Monument was created. But we're trying now to extend the boundaries of the National Monument to a ridge, sometimes called Walker Ridge, sometimes called Moloch Luyak, that is its own rich hotspot for flowers. Here we have thistles, native thistles here, surrounded by woolly sunflowers. Here's that thistle again. We have adobe lily, which is a fairly rare plant, thriving up here in the area we want to add to the National Monument. Red ribbons, a beautiful archaea that covers the slopes here. And we have yellow Mariposa lilies, red paintbrush, shooting stars. All these are some of the plants you can see in that great Moloch Luyak area that we want to add to the National Monument. We have our main campaign of both a new chapter of CNPS, which one of the reasons we created it was to get support locally for the campaign to extend the National Monument eastward. And of course, Tuleyome is one of the strongest supporters along with CNPS. Here's another plant. This is a wild onion that only grows in areas like that ridgetop. It likes the same kind of geology that's present there. Doesn't look like a typical onion, but it's an endemic onion only found in certain spots in California. Well, there are other places to see wildflowers nearby. One of them is Jepson Prairie. And this is a field of gold fields near Old Cut Lake in Jepson Prairie. And if you look at that close up, beautiful little flower. It's one of the most important groups of wildflowers here in California. Another place to see wildflowers nearby is the Glide Tuley Ranch. It's got these white plagiobothrys extending for many hundreds of feet in the right place in vernal pools. And then at the Glide Ranch, not the Glide Tuley Ranch, but the Glide Ranch are native tar plants that cover the landscape. Once again, a landscape that's been kept natural, covered with native wildflowers. And here they are close up, looking like a field of white stars. Another place to see wildflowers in vernal pools, some of the best vernal pool preservation areas in California is just to the east of us, near Sacramento at the Mather Vernal Pool Preserve. This is one of the pools there. And one of the things about vernal pools is they have as they gradually dry out, rings of different species of wildflowers, some along the edge, different ones in the bottom, and then even more species when the last water dries out at the very bottom. But one of the other places that is east of the National Monument is the Bear Creek unit of the Bureau of Land Management. When that was considered for acquisition by the Bureau of Land Management, it was thought to be too overgrazed to be of value for conservation. But when it was actually examined by botanists from UC Davis, like Ellen Dean, she said this was actually the place where rare plants are common, like this California species of erodium. We have a lot of weedy erodiums. This is a native erodium, and it's been outcompeted by non-natives most places, but because the cattle usage was so heavy at this place, it made space for this plant to survive better here than almost anywhere else. Very rare plant. Just at the edge of the city of Woodland, Tuleyome worked to preserve another rare plant site called Woodland Regional Park and Preserve. One of the reasons is to preserve this palmate birdsbeak, a federally listed endangered species. Its only home is the Central Valley, so most of the places where it lived are now farmland, but there was a little bit of area that was preserved just at the edge of Woodland, and because it was an endangered species and we could preserve it, that's one of the things that Tuleyome did. And thanks to its preservation by Tuleyome and a lot of other volunteers, it's actually doubled in population in the last year. Another beautiful plant from that area that's very hard to find, a rare plant, is Astragalus tenor, Astragalus fertile pool milkfitch. But you don't always have to go to special areas for preservation. Sometimes if you just take a back road to an area, you'll find patches of beautiful flowers like these golden Mariposa lilies, or these Sedalcias, or these ethereal spears, or these variegated native clovers, or these butter and eggs. You can see the amazing structure of the flowers close up. And a family that's mostly in California, Limnanthaceae meadifoam. Here's white meadifoam. This is a plant that is almost extinct. This is one of the last populations. It's called Contra Costa Goldfields, but it's essentially extinct in the county that it's named after. And this is a little population that survives down in Solano County. And one of the commonest and most tolerant of disturbance is our Hemsinkias. And we have a lot of those, and that's one of the few that's actually been imported to other parts of the world as kind of a weed, like in Australia, for example. And it can come in with more disturbance than virtually any other native wildflower here. So you can see it lots of places in throughout Central California. Here's Farewell to Spring, and it's named because it was, as the summer starts getting warmer and things dry out, it's the last wildflower to appear. It's one of the Clarkias. And here's purple owl's clover, another beautiful plant that you can find in fields off the back roads all through Central California. A beautiful plant, a real joy to find it where it occurs. And we still have natives here in the Central Valley in areas that even with a little bit of disturbance. Here's narrow-leaved Wildflowers, Wildflowers angustifolia, right in the field south of Winters, growing all by itself and flowering just fine. This is much more typical of what was in the Central Valley and only being unusual because it's perennial than purple needlegrass ever were. Another plant that is a native that this population's right on the floor of the Central Valley. You can still find things like this. Elegant Madia. You remember I said that there are perennial lupins right in the middle of summer. The area, the time period when John Muir was up in Yosemite, up in the cold and seeing the waterfalls and the deer and the bears and the forests. This plant was in the Central Valley because it's unusual, for a low elevation lupin to be perennial. And this is right at the edge of the Central Valley where this plant survives. And here it is up close. So one of the few lupins that does fine in the middle of summer in the low elevations in the Central Valley. Well, here we have California prairie. Flowers as far as you can see. Hardly any grasses, just like John Muir said, it's very hard to find grass. Flowers everywhere. But because that landscape in conservation plans all through California, because of that academic claim that the valley was covered with native grasses, areas like this have been just listed as non-native annual grass, the free fire zone for urban sprawl that is taking it out faster and faster all the time. Fewer and fewer flowers because the flowers are ignored and the plant that was never there in the first place gets to name the landscape. And that dogma was so thorough that back when I was in grad school, a professor came up and showed this picture to us as an example of, well, he called it hillsides full of trash plants because they weren't covered with bunch grass like Clement said they should be. Figured that all the real plants were destroyed by cattle and all these weeds now have come in, all these native wildflowers. Fortunately, you don't hear statements like that so much anymore. But we've got something really special here and we can do a lot to protect it, a lot more than is being done right now. So we got a team here, Tuleyome, CNPS, working on protecting those wildflowers that you've just seen. And that's important because California has 4,839 native plants and more than 39 million people. Both are the most of any state. Conservation here is a real challenge as a result. It could really use your help. If you'd like to help, please contact me. Dr. Glenn Holstein, Tuleyome, California Native Plant Society, Yola Calusa chapter, and here's my email, holstein@cal.net. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was amazing. I don't see any questions in the chat. Before we go, I do want to just give a little plug. Next Thursday is the National Big Day of Giving, and our theme this year is Get Wild about wildflowers at Moloch Loyick. So it seems appropriate that I would say something about it here since we're all here to hear about the wildflowers, and we've heard a little bit about the wildflowers that we're trying to protect at Moloch Loyick. That's a ridge next to the monument that we are trying to expand and protect. There are wildflowers out there that are endemic to that area that need protection, that are only found in those areas. I'm always in awe of the things that we have in California that we can't find in other areas. And so if you can, whatever you can give on Big Day of Giving next Thursday, that's our campaign right now, is to help with that expansion and to help protect those wildflowers in that area. So I just wanted to give that little plug there. So yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Holstein. Thank you. This was amazing.